Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law. In the last 35 to 40 years, women have entered the workforce in huge numbers. This did not result, however, in families having an easier time of it financially, as lots of people thought it would. Financial difficulties may, if anything, be more widespread among families today. Today, we shall discuss a book about this situation called The Two-Income Trap. Its authors are Elizabeth Warren, a professor at the Harvard Law School, and her daughter, Amelia Warren Tyagi, a consultant. With me to discuss the book is Professor Elizabeth Warren, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start out by you describing the degree to which, the extent to which, bankruptcies have increased dramatically indeed in the last 10 to 20 years?
In the early 1980s, we had about 300,000 bankruptcies in the United States. Annually. Yeah. Last year, we had about 1.6 million families who filed for bankruptcy.
So that's about a 500% increase.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what you want to note about these families is that they are in terrible financial trouble at the time they file for bankruptcy. On average, the family who filed for bankruptcy owed more than a year's worth of income in credit cards and other short-term high-interest debt.
Could that be $40,000 or $50,000 a year?
Well, the average family filing for bankruptcy has a little lower income
Okay.
at the time they file for bankruptcy,
Okay.
more in the range of about $30,000 a year.
Still pretty hefty. Okay, go ahead.
But the point is, for most of these families who file, they really have no option. If they don't file for bankruptcy, the interest rate is running so that if they don't charge another thing, if they don't incur another debt, they nonetheless next month will owe more than they owe this month. The month
Yeah.
after that they'll owe more, and the month after that they'll owe
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
For most of the families who file for bankruptcy, it really is just a declaration of financial death.
Yeah.
They can't go on any longer, and
Yeah.
that's how they end up in bankruptcy.
A little quick calculation here tells me that I think that the population of the United States has increased from roughly 240 million to roughly 300 million since 1980.
Mm-hmm.
So the population has gone up 25%. The number of families in bankruptcy has gone up 500%, and that is 20 to 1.
That's right. Or another way to say it is that the rate of filing per thousand in the population has just about quadrupled
Yeah.
in a little over 20 years in
Yeah.
the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, we should add to this. It's important to know the bankruptcy numbers, but the bankruptcy numbers are not alone. The bankruptcy numbers are just one signal for the kind of trouble that American families are in. Let's take a look at home mortgage foreclosure rates. These are people
Yeah.
who have passed the most vigorous credit screen that we have for consumers in the United States. And what's happened to home mortgage foreclosures over the last 25 years? They're up 3.5-fold.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's remarkable, particularly because interest rates are low today and housing
Yeah.
prices are strong, so that
Yeah.
when you get into financial trouble, if you're a homeowner, many people can just back out of it and
Yeah.
sell the house
Yeah.
to someone
Yeah.
else
Yeah.
unless it's too loaded down
Yeah.
with debt.
Well, we'll come back to that because one of your many significant points is that even if it is currently one of the most significant credit checks that you can pass through the United States, it's not much of a credit check
No, it's
anymore. You make the point early on in your book that bankruptcy is, I guess it's fair to say, predominantly, or at least largely, a middle-class phenomenon. I'd like you to elaborate on that and tell us if you have any statistics showing that.
Sure. You know, most people define the middle class by income. And by income, I will be the first to confess, a large proportion of the families in bankruptcy look like they're poor or at the ragged edge of the working class, middle class. But income alone doesn't really define class. You know, if a fourth grade teacher lost her job and was out of work for a year, would you describe her as not middle class any longer? If a bank president lost his job, would you describe him as not middle class any longer? If we look at the enduring criteria, education, occupation, having bought a home, it turns out that the population in bankruptcy is disproportionately middle class. So if we take anyone who went to college, as that's some indication of being middle class, anyone who has an occupation in the upper 80% of occupations in the United States, that is cutting out day laborers and housemaids and the lower status jobs, or anyone who actually went out and bought a home as middle class, our population in bankruptcy is more than 90% middle class. In other words, when we look at the families who are filing for bankruptcy, it's not the very poorest, and of course it's not the very richest. We underrepresent brain surgeons and college professors, but we also underrepresent day laborers and shop clerks. Bankruptcy is about the middle class and the kind of financial trouble that the middle class faces.
Yeah. You know, Elizabeth, just so people understand that defining a class by aspiration is nothing new. We all know of the impecunious aristocrat in England, for example, who was not considered any the less an aristocrat. I was just reading today a book by Richard Pipes, one of your colleagues, about the terrorists, a fellow named Gottlieb, were the terrorists of the 1880s in Russia, an impecunious aristocratic family. So defining people by aspiration is nothing new, and that's really all you've done.
And you know what? It's particularly important in bankruptcy to understand them that way, because 2 out of every 3 families that file for bankruptcy have had a significant job interruption before they file for bankruptcy. Somebody's lost a job, someone's had a serious cutback. In the cases of husbands and wives, which we'll be talking about in a minute, often both of them have lost a job before the bankruptcy filing. So we're really talking about people who are way down on the income side, but who, in terms of their own aspirations, class status, vision of themselves, are solidly middle-class people.
You make the point, which I think is very intimately related, that these are fundamentally people. I'd like you to explain what you mean by this. These are fundamentally people who played by the rules, and the reason I think this is related, and you might comment on this as well, is that these folks went broke trying to be middle class.
I wish it were otherwise. You know, I have to tell you, our research started with a single fact, and that is the likelihood that a family with children would end up in bankruptcy. We discovered that families who have children in the household are nearly 3 times more likely to end up filing for bankruptcy than families who don't have children. And this whole book was an enterprise to try to understand that, because I could understand a story that says, the young and irresponsible are going bankrupt. You know, they're out there fresh out of college. They have those newly minted credit cards, and they're just saying, charge it, charge it, charge it too often. I can at least understand that story. I could understand a story about the elderly that says declining health, limited incomes, no prospects to earn more in the future, too little set aside for retirement. They'll go broke in great numbers. I could even understand a story about singles who were self-indulgent. But tell me a story about how it is that married couples, or that women or men trying to raise children on their own, would be at disproportionate risk for going bankrupt. And it doesn't add up to a story of people who are hooping off money on fancy things they can't afford. What our data ultimately show is the principal reason these families end up in bankruptcy is they're trying to make mortgage payments, health insurance payments, car payments. They now have to have 2 cars when they have both mom and dad in the workforce, and child care payments. And that by the time they make those 4 payments, today's 2-income family, to focus on what was supposed to be our economic success story, has less money left over than their 1-income parents had a generation ago.
Elizabeth, we'll get into that extensively. But one of the, you say this surprises you. Well, in a sense, it doesn't surprise me. I guess my question is, why should it surprise you? Because my own children, one of my own kids is going through this now, and I went through it, and I'd be surprised if most people don't go through it. When you have children, boy, your expenses leap astronomically. And everybody, I'll tell you a little story. I went to Washington in 1963 with my wife immediately upon graduating from law school. I made $7,000 a year. My wife made $5,000 a year. We made a total of $12,000 a year. We were rich as pigs. Mm-hmm. You know, a few years later we had kids, and I was making more money, and boy, were we in the poorhouse. So why is this a surprise?
Well, in one sense, it's a surprise because of all that we read now in the popular media, and actually many of the finger waggers out of Washington, and that is that Americans are spending too much on stuff. That the reason they're going broke is they're going broke because of too many Game Boys, too many fancy sneakers that cost $200, too much consumption, too much consumption. But let me go back to what these data showed. What these data show is that today's family with children is going broke over the basics. What's happened in the last generation is a fully employed father's wages, a man's wages, have gone up, as we know, less than 1%. Depending on the data you want to look at, they've actually declined slightly or stayed flat when adjusted for inflation.
Right.
But the family income has gone up 75% in that period of time. Why? Because they've added a second worker. This is for the standard household, mom, dad, and 2 kids. But that family today, by the time it makes its mortgage payment, its health insurance payment, its car payment, and its after-school or preschool care for its children, the payments for those 4 things, mean that family today has less money left over than the one-income family had a generation ago. Yeah. So with 2 people in the workforce, all the added expenses of lunches out and better clothes and gasoline to get to work, the underlying reality is that today's 2-income family is having to spend so much more just for the core, just for the basics, just for the mortgage and the health insurance and the car and the preschool than parents had to spend a generation ago. And that's what it is that's driving them into bankruptcy. Yeah. So in other words, in one sense you can say, yes, we always understood that having children is expensive. But what's happened in a single generation is the cost of having children has shot way out of reach of the average median earner.
I want to come back to that in just a moment, because I will want to come back to your idea that in effect it is what you call fixed costs. Mm-hmm. Those are not fixed costs in the economist sense, but they're fixed costs in the human sense. Right. But before we do that, isn't the real problem here, or maybe a real problem here, when you point out, for example, that the income on an inflation-adjusted basis, in other words, ceteris paribus, everything equal, right, is 75% higher, and yet people are going broke. The problem, isn't it, is that the cost of living index, but from 1973 to now, is up 400%, and from 1960 to now is up 600%. Family would have to be making, depending what year you choose, 400% more or 600% more, not 75% more.
That's a nice way to put it. Indeed, one of the things that's interesting to look at when you compare family budgets I just picked the early 1970s, tried to pick that as one generation. So we're not loading the numbers by moving back into the 50s or even the 60s. Yeah. So in 30 years, what's happened to the typical budget for the typical family? Clothing. Families today surely are spending more on clothing. What the data show, when you pull them apart and you adjust for inflation, is that today's mom, dad, and 2 kids is spending 21% less for clothing than a family spent a generation ago. How about food? Today's families are eating out more than ever. So let's add it all together. How much families spend at the grocery store, how much they spend eating out, all that designer water that they buy that nobody bought a generation ago. What's happened? Today's family is spending 22% less on food, including eating out, than they spent a generation ago. Appliances. Everyone wants to talk about how today's family has microwave ovens and popcorn poppers and espresso machines that we didn't have a generation ago. Inflation-adjusted dollars, today's families are spending 44% less on appliances than they spent a generation ago. Less on furniture, less on floor coverings, less on tobacco, a little more on alcohol.
It's understandable.
I think so. But the real point here is that Americans have actually cut where they spend. They are spending on these big costs, in a human sense, the fixed costs once you've committed to that mortgage, once you've committed to make health insurance payments, once you've committed to make those car payments. They've committed to big fixed costs that they have to make month after month after month. And today, it takes 2 salaries just to make those fixed costs. And families have actually ended up spending less in all those categories where there was at least some discretion in the past.
Yeah. Not to argue with you, but let me make the opposite point and see how you respond to it.
Sure.
And not to argue with you. That's what people say before they begin arguing.
Before
with
they
you.
argue.
Yeah.
I can take it.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. If you're at Harvard Law School, you probably get it every day. Even though people are spending less on a lot of consumer goods, proportionately, they're spending less than they were 20 and 30 years ago. Nevertheless, when you're financially close to the bone, shouldn't people avoid spending money on eating out, home entertainment centers? Shouldn't they buy, particularly given the increased the quality of cars in the last 20 years? You know, a car these days is nothing for cars to go 150 or 200,000 miles. Shouldn't they be buying used cars? In other words, putting aside the question of mortgages for one moment, because mortgages in schools seem to me to be the really big problem, and I think you present them as such. Mm-hmm. Putting those aside for just one moment, I mean, aren't there ways people ought to be cutting back to give the overconsumptionists their due, one might say?
Well, you know, we all have that intuition, don't we? And I don't know if it's born of the newspapers, if it's born of casting a covetous eye at what the neighbors are purchasing. I don't know for sure where it comes from, but let me put it this way. Most of the families who are in financial trouble have cut back until there is no muscle left. So the median family who files for bankruptcy, their cars are 9 to 11 years old. They're not driving new cars. Uh-huh. Most of them haven't bought new clothes in, you know, they bought shoes for the kids because you have no options there.
Yeah.
And they've dressed their children in hand-me-downs to the extent that they can. For the families who are in real financial trouble, talking about cutting back is often a cruel joke. These are families who've done everything they can in the small ways. They've clipped every coupon, they've bought pasta in bulk, they haven't bought new cars, they haven't bought new clothes, they don't have cable on their television. Now, if you want to move to those who are a little more financially secure, there's no doubt about it. There's a segment of the American population that spent a lot more. They're spending a lot more on clothing, they're spending a lot more on food, they're having a great time. But we don't want to be fooled by looking at the lives of the upper 20%, that's what's happening in the median. Indeed, the way I'm coming to understand much of the economics of the family is that America could have been described for most of the 20th century as economics that looked like this. There weren't many people at the bottom, there weren't many people at the top. People were mostly clustered in the middle, and people in the middle were mostly making it. They were mostly doing pretty well. In fact, let me give you the average. In 1971, the average family, remember a one-income family, was putting aside 11% of its take-home pay in savings, and it was carrying only 3% of its take-home pay in car payments, credit card payments, other kinds of consumer payments other than mortgage. Now let's take a look at what's happened in the middle by the year 2002. The median family is putting away about 1% of its take-home pay in savings. Here they've got mom and dad at work, they're putting aside about 1%, and they're now carrying 12% of their take-home pay in car payments and principally now credit card debt. In other words, these families are upside down financially. What we're starting to see is more pressure toward the two ends. If you will, something of a hollowing out in the middle. a lot of people who are middle-class families who've clipped coupons, who've bought pasta in bulk, and who are waking up in the middle of the night scared.
Sweating. Let me ask you a question. We're supposed to go to a break now, but I want to ask you this question first,
Sure.
and then we'll go to the break afterwards. I don't remember reading in the book. Maybe I missed it. Normally, I'm a pretty careful reader. Don't miss too much, I think. But I don't remember reading in the book some of the things that you just said. As, for example, that people who are entering bankruptcy are driving 9- and 10-year-old cars, and they've cut back on clothes, and they've cut back on food. And I think that's a very crucial point that you make. And what doesn't that point also mean? That even if bankruptcy is a middle-class phenomenon by aspiration, what we're seeing is lots of families who seek middle-classness, so to speak, are actually descending into the poor because the economic situation is just too much for them.
You know, one of the things that was most wrenching about doing this research was that we not only collected questionnaire data from these families and collected all of the information out of their court records, which are filed under penalty of perjury, we also did telephone interviews with these families. And more than half of the people we interviewed, at some point or another in the conversation, would start to cry about what had happened to their lives. These are people who worked hard, who played by the rules. They got decent educations, they got married, they had kids, they bought homes. They made their big financial commitments to try to educate their children, to try to keep their children safe, to try to keep their children in decent neighborhoods. And these are families who see themselves as losing their already tenuous hold on the middle class.
Yeah.
Many of these people are people on the way down.
This happened in the Weimar Republic, which is not a good sign. Before we go to break again, so, you know, I don't want them to be overly concerned. I know we're supposed to have a break. Isn't part of the problem, or didn't the problem arise in part because feminists who wanted women to get out, to get a fair break and get out into the workforce and get the same pay that men get? And, you know, it's not perfect by a long shot yet, but strides have been made and are being made. They never foresaw this. One could even argue they didn't even really care about the possibility because they were very concerned with women at long last getting a decent break in American society. And it's like the rules of the game changed in the middle. The rug got pulled out from under people, and really the only people, as I understand it, who are not subject to what you're talking about, only two-income families, are those who, and I think a lot of feminists would fall into this class, decided that they were going to become lawyers or doctors. They're doing very nicely, thank you. It's that the rug has been pulled out from a lot of the rest of the world. Is that any merit in any of that?
You know, the feminist movement very much had its roots in opportunity, that women have to have the opportunity to go into the workforce. But feminists by themselves can't be blamed for not seeing what no one else saw either.
True.
And that is, most families saw and believed that if he's at work and bringing in a certain amount of money, and we could add my salary on top of that, that's how it is we can afford that house in the suburbs. That's how it is that we can keep health insurance for our family. That's how it is that we can have a safe car, that we can put those big bubble car seats in. Indeed, there are books, not just from the 1970s, but from the 2000s, in which economists and other social commentators say the family that has both mom and dad in the workforce is economically diversified. If he loses his job, she still has her job. If she loses her job, he still has his job. And to me, that is the heart of the two-income trap. When the budget shifted to take account of both of those incomes, so that going from needing 52 paychecks a year in order to make the mortgage payment and the health insurance payment, to needing 104 paychecks a year, his and her paychecks, in order to make the mortgage payment and the health insurance payment. The family didn't get financially safer. the family got riskier. So as prices are shooting up, prices for homes in suburbs, for example, what's happening is women, mothers, were increasingly going back to work to try to hit the target, to try to find a way to pay that mortgage. And what happened? The prices shot up, more of them went to work, the prices shot up again, more of them went to work, and they got caught in a trap that no one foresaw, least of all the families themselves.
Well, you're quite right. We'll have to go to break. Before we do, I'll give the audience, if I may put it this way, a little lesson in economics. The Consumer Price Index, calculated as 100 as of 1790, was only 101 in 1860, just before the beginning of the Civil War. It was only about 245 in 1945 at the end of World War II. As of 2000, which doesn't even include whatever inflation we've had in the last year, it stood at something like 2,099. And that tells a big story about why what happened to the two-income family did happen. Okay, at long last, we're going to a break. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Arthur Broadhurst. I am a graduate of the Massachusetts School of Law's first class in 1990. I've practiced law in both Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and my law firm is called Broadhurst & Beebe. I also served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives for 14 years. What made this possible? I was among the first graduates of Mass School of Law. We were devoted, dedicated, and ambitious people from all walks of life who wanted to learn and practice law. Many of my classmates are now successful attorneys. Some are even law professors. Because of my gratitude to Mass School of Law, I am a trustee of MSL, and I am also a trustee of MSL's new American College of History and Legal Studies, called ACHLS. ACHLS will give you an opportunity to be among an initial group, just like my classmates and I were at MSL over 20 years ago. American College of History and Legal Studies is an undergraduate college located in Salem, New Hampshire. ACHLS will give you a rigorous education that will enable you to do well in many fields. It also offers pathways into law school. ACHLS offers a bachelor's degree in history and legal studies. All classes are taught using the combination of the discussion method used at MSL and Harkness table method from Phillips Exeter. ACHLS will teach you to think, write, and speak well. Be a part of the inaugural class at American College of History and Legal Studies and start your future like I did at MSL. To apply and find out more about generous tuition scholarships, go to www.achls.org or call today 603-204-3919. That's 603-204-3919. Thank you, and I hope to see you all on campus soon.
Elizabeth, let's just spend this segment talking about the deregulation of the bank and credit card companies, the kinds of interest rates this freed the companies to charge. So why don't we start off by talking about deregulation, when it occurred and what it meant.
You know, we've had usury laws around the world since biblical times, and it just means there's a cap on how much someone can charge for interest rates. They were there in colonial times. They've been there in United States laws well through the 20th century.
Isn't it a Christian tradition that one is not to charge usury?
Well, that's the question. Or what defines usury, whether or not the rate too high. Is it any interest at all, or is it
that's what I meant,
a more than reasonable rate of
Yeah.
interest? So, and biblical scholars go back and forth about this question. But the point is, we've been wrestling in humankind with the question about how to put some constraints on the one who has the money and lends it to the one in need. So what happened is in the early 1980s, we had almost at the same time, within months of each other, the credit card industry was effectively deregulated by the Supreme Court, and the home mortgage lending industry was deregulated by Congress. Now, what's interesting about this is the usury caps were effectively erased with no public policy debates, no discussion about what the real implications would be. And
Can I ask you a question? You may not know the answer, and it's not directly relevant, but it's humanly interesting. Wasn't that the case that was argued by Bob Bork in favor of the credit card, on the side of the credit card industry after he was Solicitor General?
Now, I don't know on this. Marquette is the decision in the United States Supreme Court that effectively deregulates. So I don't know if Bork was involved in it or not.
But go ahead. I interrupted you, so go ahead.
No, that's all right. He shouldn't have been, because it should have been before Bork was Solicitor General. But we could, I'm trying to think what the years would do.
I think he argued on the private side, but I could be wrong.
Anyway, what happened is they deregulated so that credit card companies, mortgage lenders could charge whatever they wanted. A few years go by, because you may remember in the early 1980s we have very high inflation rates. We're just beginning to deregulate.
19% for a while.
That's right.
Yeah.
Beginning to deregulate the savings and loans. The banks are becoming a little more competitive. And then starting in the early 90s, a new industry is born. Again, very quietly, but it's known as the subprime industry. And that's the part of the lending industry that doesn't do the old-fashioned kind of lending. That is, they look at someone like Elizabeth Warren and they say, we think she'll be able to pay back without any difficulty, and therefore we'll lend to her at whatever is the interest rate that they think reflects risk and the possibility of inflation. Instead, what happened is they said, you know, someone from whom we could make really good money is not to lend to that Elizabeth Warren because she pays back on time and in full. It's to lend to her nephew who doesn't have an income yet, who's a college student, who is sporadically employed. Let's lend to him and count on the fact that he'll make minimum monthly payments, and he may even occasionally skip a payment. And if he's already built up some debt by the time he skips a payment, we could jack up the interest rate on that, and that may improve our overall profit.
You mean that there's a higher interest rate when they're charging interest on interest than when
That's
they're charging
right.
interest on principal?
Well, and a higher interest rate, even though you borrowed the money back at 8.99%, it turns out that most credit card contracts are written today so that the credit card company has an unfettered ability to change the interest rate. So the interest rate may be changed because interest rates change generally in the country, but it may also be changed because you missed a payment, because you went over limit, because you missed a payment on another bill, and that changes your credit report, and so they change the interest rate, or because you applied for a credit card somewhere else, and the current company found out that you applied for another credit card, and that changes your credit score, and so they up your interest rate. And what the credit card companies discovered is the profits to be made from lending to people who make minimum monthly payments, who pay for a while and then skip a payment, miss a payment, fall behind. That's where the real profits in the industry are to be made. You know, I'm not a very profitable customer because I do pay in full on time. 85% of the revenues from credit card companies come from interest payments, from people making those low minimum monthly payments, and from fees. Indeed, companies have figured out—
What are the fees?
Fees are everything from your annual fee, which has actually been going down because people like me don't want to pay it, to the fee if your check doesn't clear, to the fee if your bill arrives one day late, your payment arrives one day late, if you go over the credit limit on your card. Fees were about $1.7 billion in 1998. That's what credit card companies collected. Last year, they collected more than $10 billion.
Are these the companies, Elizabeth, just to take one example? I watch the History Channel a lot, which is a version of history, particularly if you love war, you know. And a lot of the stuff they do, though, is quite good. Some of it is reputed not to be exactly accurate. But in the commercials, these companies are always advertising, you know, you don't have to qualify for credit, just call us, this, that, and the other. Why are people, why are people taking them up on those? They're paying through the nose, aren't they?
Well, you know, it's both halves. Partly, we market debt today in ways that just didn't exist 15 years ago. Think about that. Today, there's no one marketing savings to speak of. Sure, I've seen one commercial for why it's good to invest and to hold off to the future. And, you know, there's the Schwabs of the world who say if you have an investment portfolio, be sure to come to us. But no one's marketing the notion of set aside a little out of your paycheck. And that's going to help you buy things in the future. It's going to help you have a safer future. It's going to help you provide for your children or for your retirement. That's just something you're supposed to know. But there are multi-million-dollar campaigns launched in the U.S. week after week to try to get people to lay down that credit card over and over and over, to try to get people to put a second mortgage on their homes, to try to get people to go buy brand new cars at zero financing, right?
Yeah.
Over and over and over, we market, and we market in the most sophisticated ways possible, take on some debt. But you know, you have to look at this the other way too. That's part of the story about what's happened. But the other part of the story is that families have turned to debt when the economics of the times have become far more than they can manage on their income. So for example, many of the families that we interviewed in bankruptcy, as I said, 2 out of 3 had had a significant job loss. 50% of them had had a serious medical problem, and you see the overlap, so that it's about 75% have had either a medical or a job problem. Throw in divorce, and we're up at 90% of the families who file for bankruptcy. That's often when families turn to credit cards. Doctors now, emergency rooms, if you don't have health insurance, lay down that credit card. Middle-class families don't have Medicaid for them. What do they have? They have MasterCard and Visa.
This is what you mean when you talk about extensively, I may say, about the lack of a safety net, because people are, quote, mortgaged up to the hilt, that it takes every nickel of their 2 incomes, and if they have one disaster, medical, job, and everybody's got these disasters.
That's right.
Boy, they are, SOL is not something to be said on television, but that's what it is.
You know, but that is the problem, and that is how much of the middle class is living just one misstep away from complete collapse. I talk to families since this book has come out who will say to me, Professor Warren, we're living your life, the life you describe in the 2-income trap. If I lost my job, if my husband got sick for an extended period of time, if one of our children had a really serious health diagnosis and one of us needed to stay home with her, we'd lose our house. Within 3 months, we would have lost everything that keeps us in the middle class. Our house, our car, our health insurance
You've said
would be gone.
you've said to me, before the next break, I want to get to 2 questions. First, you said to me that Citicorp just announced that it's coming out with a credit card that has a 41% interest rate?
41% interest rate. They do it by financing people who are already in financial trouble. So they say, fine, you've got this credit card. If you've missed a payment, we're going to be up at 41%. Or they say, we're glad to offer you some more money even though you are already skipping payments, missing payments, you've lost your job, you've been in the hospital because you're sick. But down in the fine print, I mean, let's face it, they do not put on the front of the envelope inside a credit card for 41% interest. It's that the experts in reading the card have figured out that this is a 41% interest rate.
This is loan sharking.
It used to be, back when it was illegal. You know, you have to understand, today, Citibank and MBNA, the second biggest credit card issuer, are hailed on Wall Street for doing things that would have landed their CEOs in jail just 25 years ago. That's how quickly we've changed. You know, another way to emphasize this is to tell you the story. We tell the story in the book about Jamal. Can I tell you that story briefly? This is a fellow who works for a major company. He had health insurance and he had a massive coronary. He thought he would be protected. His wife's at work, they have 3 children, they've committed all of their income to their mortgage, to their car payments, to their health insurance. So he has this massive heart attack. The insurance company's going to take care of the medical bills. But what happens? He can't work for more than 3 months. They do everything they can to try to stay current with their payments. But the inevitable happens. They miss a mortgage payment. And now it's bearing down on the second mortgage payment and they're falling behind. And the day comes when the phone rings and Jamal said, I knew that call was coming. Who was on the phone? It was the mortgage company. And the first words are, we see that you are now late on your second mortgage payment here. And he said he closed his eyes as he waited to hear how they were going to threaten him, how they were going to insist that he pay, they were going to add additional charges. But what was the next sentence? We think you may be in some financial difficulty, so we'd like to help you out by refinancing your mortgage. We'll offer you some cash, we'll put just a little larger mortgage on your house, and you pay us back when you can. Now, Jamal's no dummy. He kept asking questions about it and figured out that what they were really talking about doing was more than doubling the interest rate on his house. And that if he couldn't make the mortgage payment right now, he sure as heck couldn't make the mortgage payment once they doubled it. But
and they're going to take the house and sell it at a great profit.
That's exactly right. They're going to make money if he pays, and they're going to make money if he doesn't pay. And that's become the
Except he's going to be on the street.
And the difference is Jamal and his family will be on the street. And that's become the heart of what's happened with the credit industry. It has divided. I'm getting a great mortgage at a low interest rate, but I have lifetime tenure. I can make my payments on time. The world that lives with job loss and with medical problems that they can't pay for, who end up divorced, those families are ending up in a very different credit world.
Look, let me ask you something. Well, you know, that's one of the reasons that the Vox Populi, the people at large, don't have much sympathy for academics, but who have tenure. But let me ask you a question, and we'll delay the break until you're finished with however long an answer you care to make. A major point in the book, as I said before, and then we didn't really elaborate it, is that people are undertaking mortgages that are far too large because that is necessary in order to get into good school districts. And that's one of the places where there's been the maximum, most inflation. But look, do people really have to buy houses quite as big as the houses they're buying? Wouldn't it be possible to buy less expensive, smaller, or older houses in some of these areas and undertake, therefore, a lesser mortgage?
You know, this is a variation on the overconsumption myth. It's sort of the overconsumption myth housing division. People see the new houses springing up in the suburbs, and they see that the square footage is up. They see that they have spa bathrooms and granite countertops. That's fine. That's what's happening at the top end. Let's talk about where the median earning family is living in the United States today. The family earning at the median has increased its housing size. It's gone from 5.7 rooms to 6.1 rooms. And what the federal data show is that on average, that either means they've picked up a second bathroom or a third bedroom.
I was going to say, it sounds like a bathroom.
So we're not talking about families who are living in huge housing. Indeed, today's median earning family is more than twice as likely to be living in a house that's more than 25 years old than their families were a generation ago. So they are moving into older housing. They're moving into modestly sized housing, but here comes the hooker on what's happened to the prices of the houses that they're living in. Today's median earning family living in that median house is more than 4 times more likely to be house poor. That is, dedicating more than 35% of their income to just making the mortgage payment than they were a generation ago. What's happened in the United States is that families with children believe that the number of places that they can buy homes and still send their children to public schools is shrinking. And so families are bidding up prices in places with decent school districts, and the consequence is their mortgage as a proportion of their total income is reaching way out of proportion. At a time when the average male's wages have not increased by a full 1%, the amount that the family is spending on mortgages has gone up 69%.
You know, there was a story in the Times just this week or last week about families who bought in the Poconos who live in New York City,
I was
And,
interviewed for this story. I
were you?
talked to these people.
Well, it was a textbook example of what you're talking about. They sell them at prices that are too high. They can't make. They end up losing their houses.
Yeah. And you know, this is the consequence of losing a house is more than just financial. The children lose their schools. The family loses a lot of their self-identity and a lot of their hold on the middle class. We're watching middle-class families who are being pushed out of their homes, who are being foreclosed against, or who are selling under duress. It turns out to be the same thing. They're moving back in with mom and dad, so we end up with 3 generations in modestly sized housing. They're moving into apartments in much rougher neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Families are losing their hold on their place in the middle class, and more critically for the families, they're losing what they see as the opportunity for their children to get the kind of education they're going to need to make it into the middle class themselves.
Yeah. All right, our producers they're really having a nervous breakdown because they don't call a break here. So I'll call a break. We'll be back in just a minute. Stay with us again for the final segment of this particular program.
Hello, my name is Anne Hemingway. I earned my Juris Doctorate degree from the Massachusetts School of Law in 2009. I currently practice law in Massachusetts. I also assist in bar exam preparation at MSL. I'm here to talk to you about the new American College of History and Legal Studies in Salem, New Hampshire, which is being created by the Massachusetts School of Law. The ACHLS offers a BA degree in History and Legal Studies to students who already have 60 college credits or an associate's degree. It is a completion college. It teaches the junior and senior years of undergraduate study. The ACHLS also offers guaranteed pathways into law school for those who wish to go on to law school, and it likewise provides a rigorous education to others. It offers 1/2 tuition remission scholarships of $5,000 to those who qualify. Tuition is $10,000 per year, but is only $5,000 for those who qualify for scholarships. The ACHLS has convenient evening programs that meet 3 nights a week. The college will be located right off of Exit 2, off of I-93 in Salem, New Hampshire. The American College of History and Legal Studies is a school where you can begin your future. So go to www.achls.org or call 603-204-3919. That's 603-204-3919 today to apply and to learn more about scholarships. You can also become a fan of ACHLS on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Law and History. Thank you, and I hope to see you in class.
It's raining, and so I put the newspaper over my head. I forgot my umbrella, and I didn't want to go walk over the overpass. And then I heard the whistle and the light. I was walking right into a train. This guy, he pulled me back.
Look, listen, and live, or someone you love will get hurt.
I just almost died.
How far would you go to help someone? Would you go to the end of your driveway? Would you cross a street? Would you cross an ocean? To a place 6,000 miles from home? And how long would you go? Would you go for a week? A month? A year? Would you go for 2 years? Would you go if you could use your knowledge to teach someone, and in the process, maybe learn something yourself? Life is calling. How far will you go? Peace Corps.
The Massachusetts School of Law in Andover offers an accessible, affordable legal education to both full-time and part-time law students. When making admissions decisions, MS Law looks at all aspects of a candidate's qualifications and does not consider the flawed LSAT. At a tuition of less than half of all the other law schools in New England, it is by far the most affordable. Our teaching and standards are rigorous. Our students learn to think clearly, to write well, and to advocate effectively for others. Decide today to make a difference.
Welcome back. Elizabeth, I presume that the mortgage and credit card and banking industries would say something like the following, that you and your daughter have focused on what might be called the pathology, the downside of easier credit, that in general, the easing of credit that occurred from 1980 onward has benefited the country immensely by making credit and therefore a better economic life available to people who never could get it before. You know the old story, banks will loan you all you need when you don't need the money, or all you want when you don't need the money. But God forbid you should need the money, you can't get 1 red cent from a bank. That goes back to the days before the easing of credit. And they'll say that were we to re-regulate credit, as you suggest, there would be a lot of hardship on people who once again would be relegated to not being able to get credit, as women couldn't, as minorities couldn't in the old days. And values in the economy will go down dramatically, and really we'd be facing economic disaster. What's your response to all of that?
Well, you know, I've heard him make this argument. You're exactly right. This is the standard argument from the credit industry. You're all better off for our lending all this money and making these profits off middle-class families who are having trouble repaying it. So let's start with the home mortgage industry, because this is the classic, right? If we didn't lend you so much money, you wouldn't be out there buying houses. Well, the subprime mortgage industry, that is the one that's charging 15% for these mortgages instead of 6% for these mortgages, that was Citi Financial, the subprime arm of Citibank, was charging an average of about 15.5% on its mortgages at a time when mortgage rates were a little over 6%. Where do most of those mortgages go? Do they go to help poorer families or less well-off families get into homes in the first instance? No. More than 80% of subprime mortgages are refinances. They're financing people out of their 6% mortgages and financing them into their 15.5% mortgages.
Why are people doing that?
Why do people do that? Why don't we ask Citi Financial? In the book, we talk about what happens when Citi Financial got sued for some of its mortgage practices. And one of its loan officers gave a deposition. Now remember, that's a sworn deposition. And he was asked exactly this question. How did you charge people so much at a time when interest rates were so low? His response, I'll have to paraphrase, but the exact words are in the book. Well, when we talked to somebody, because these were usually over the phone, and they sounded like they were old or young and unsophisticated or a minority, we just loaded on all the fees and charges that we had, and they usually would go ahead and pay. In other words, they counted on the fact that there's a lack of sophistication about mortgage products among many folks, and that they would not reveal true costs.
Can I summarize what I think
Yeah.
you're saying? You're saying that their argument is false because it has not created a stronger economy. They're taking advantage of people who don't know better.
Indeed, today's subprime mortgages, 1 in every 11 in the United States today is in default and foreclosure. They're not helping people get into homes, they're helping people get out of homes. This is the lose your home business, not the get your home business.
How about the credit card industry that's making money available
Let's
to people?
talk about the credit card industry. Last year alone, do you know how much people paid in interest and fees on credit cards? $90 billion in the United States. And who do you think paid it? I didn't pay it. It wasn't paid in the top 20%, and it wasn't paid by the bottom 20%. This is $90 billion that was drained out of the pockets of middle-income
but money alone
families.
doesn't, you know, I know this sounds odd, but money alone, amount alone doesn't say much. It's a question of percentage, isn't it?
Well, percentage of what? Families are now carrying 12% of their annual income in credit card and other short-term debt. Families are going broke under this load of debt. And let's look at the big picture. The credit card companies want to look at the big picture, then let's back it all the way up. What exactly is the long-term interest here? If families have spent next week's income and next month's income, and goodness, we're at the point now, next year's income, what exactly is going to happen to the economy? We only have two options here. Either there's going to be an extended period where consumers now have to underconsume to pay that debt back, right? You don't spend this year's salary, you have to spend 20% less than this year's salary to pay off that old debt. Or there's going to be massive default in the United States.
In other words, the day of reckoning will come.
The day of reckoning will come. The idea that we have a strong economy because we have pumped up consumer debt is just false.
It's another bubble.
It's worse than a bubble in this case. This is one for which we must either pay back or have massive default on the other end.
Look, we have only about 2 minutes left, and therefore I shall, as is my wont, rudely interrupt and ask you to tell a story because I think it's indicative of the kinds of problem we face in trying to remedy this. Tell a story about your relationships with Hillary Clinton.
I wrote an op-ed in the late 1990s that ended up in the New York Times talking about the then pending bankruptcy legislation. Credit card companies were pushing for a bill to make it harder for families to go into bankruptcy and get rid of credit card debt. It was a very straightforward piece of special interest legislation. And I pointed out through the data, some of the data that are in this book, that would fall disproportionately hard on women with children. Mrs. Clinton evidently saw the op-ed, placed a phone call, said her office called and said she's going to be in Boston. Would you be willing to meet with her? So I said, sure. I went down to the hotel where she was giving a speech. When she was through with her speech, we were ushered off into a tiny little room and had our little lunch, hamburgers and French fries, and I had my charts and graphs, and I started in.
I had tea for you and a hamburger for her. Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
Mrs. Clinton looked at the charts and graphs. I start talking her through, here's how the bankruptcy system works, here's how consumer credit works, here's how the pieces go, here's how the bill would change the following pieces. And I got to tell you, Mrs. Clinton got it. She's the smartest student I've ever dealt with. 20 minutes into this conversation, she could finish the sentences, she could predict what the data would show, she could see how the pieces get together. And she said at the end of our conversation, we were together about half an hour, she stood up and she said, Professor Warren, I'm going to count on you to help me stop this awful bill. And we had our picture taken. She goes back to Washington. Now, I learned from a White House staffer a little bit later that President Clinton had been quietly supporting the bankruptcy bill. It was one of those economic issues that would show that the new Democrats could play ball with banking interests. And besides that, it's under the radar screen. It doesn't make the front page of the daily newspaper.
We only have 30 seconds left, so I want you to get to your
So,
ultimate points.
Mrs. Clinton got the White House reversed on this. One of the last things her husband did was veto the bankruptcy bill, and in her autobiography, she takes credit for getting the bankruptcy bill vetoed. Mrs. Clinton then gets elected to the Senate, and one of the first bills that comes up in the Senate is the bill,
Same bill,
that her husband had vetoed. Mrs. Clinton, as Senator Clinton, rather
Supports
than as First Lady, turned around and voted in favor of it.
because she got $140,000 from the industry.
You know, it's more than just money. It's the pressure the industry bears in making campaign contributions, in lobbying, in organizing its constituency. In the area of consumer finance, it is not a level playing field.
So
All
here
the
we
money
have-
is on the side of the banks.
We have to wrap this up, but I mean, what it comes down to, right, is we have a liberal hero who was bought off.
We have a liberal hero who was pressured, and pressured by an industry that understands that getting its way in Washington will improve its bottom line.
We have to wrap. Our people have had an absolute nervous breakdown. They're on the floor. Thank you very much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.